Today we're considering Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 through 23. As always, we'll begin by hearing the passage read in the ESV version.
Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. If, with Christ, you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, referring to things that all perish as they are used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body. But they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh.
Okay, this section's a bit more complicated than the previous ones for two reasons. First, in it, Paul is interspersing what appear to be quotations from the Colossian philosophers to whom he introduced us in the preceding passage by refuting and correcting their teaching. So it isn't always easy to tell what's Paul's own writing and where he's actually quoting something he disagrees with. The second issue is that the language here tends to be a bit obscure, especially in verse 23. There are a number of words that appear only once in the New Testament, so our ability to know what they mean has to be determined a lot by the context. Overall, verses 16 through 23 are the practical outworking of the theology that is articulated in the previous passage, 8 through 15. In those earlier verses, we heard that the Colossian opponents were saying that our lives are controlled by heavenly powers that must be appeased. And we heard Paul's retort that at the cross, Christ has triumphed completely over those powers. Now, as we move forward, we see that bad theology leads to bad practice. The opponents are at the very least inferring that their practices are a superior means of encountering God than the gospel proclaimed by Epaphras and ratified by Paul. Well, what do these practices involve? In verse 16, the focus seems to be on regulations about food and drink and religious observances such as festivals, new moons, and Sabbaths. Most of these have antecedents in the Jewish law, but could also be practiced in different ways by Gentiles. The Sabbath, however, was a uniquely Jewish custom. In the Old Testament, these practices foreshadowed what was yet to come. From the perspective of that era, as Paul continues in verse 17, in other words, they were pointing forward to the reality that was to come, which has now come in Christ. Verse 18 explains more about the practices commended by the opponents. They would rule the Christian Colossians out of bounds. The verb in the original language literally has to do with an umpire in one of the games disqualifying a competitor. The false teachers delight in humility, a term that in the Greek translation of the Old Testament refers to fasting for religious purposes. In context, we have to understand the humility touted by the opponents as false humility. The false teachers also promote participation in the worship of angels. The phrase probably refers not to worship supposedly given to angels, but to supposed participation by the practitioners with the worship of God that the angels are expressing in heaven. The thought is that their ascetic practices, fasting among others, purify them so that they're qualified to enter into the visionary experiences supposed to be associated with the way the angels worship God. Paul's critique in the same verse is sharp. Evidently, these opponents claim to be believers because he says they are severed from the head. They're insisting on their way, however, as a higher way, but instead it's a dangerous way that can lead only to destruction. Their minds are far from being spiritual. Instead, their boasts of religious experience and supposedly higher thinking are all grounded in the flesh. Paul's not saying that he's opposed to spiritual experiences. Elsewhere, for example, in the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians, he's quite bold about describing his own. But these people are claiming fullness with God, but all they are full of is their own pride. As verse 19 discloses, it's because, again, they are separated from Christ, who is the head of the body and holds it together. As Paul concludes this section, he reminds the Colossians again of the triumph of Christ over these elemental spirits of the universe, the powers that we encountered in the preceding section. Remember, these are the powers to whom the Colossian opponents were ascribing all kinds of significance, that they had some rulership over even elements of the created order itself, and needed to be appeased, in the view of the opponents, in order that people would simply be able to do life. But when Christ died and the Colossians were united with him by faith, Paul says they died from those powers and their control, from the powers. That is, the powers no longer had authority or control over them. But evidently, some of the Colossians, at least, are still living as if they were subject to the powers, and they're yielding to the suasion of the opponents and submitting to regulations concerning perishable things like food and drink that, once they're consumed, are used up and cease to exist. The regulations sound spiritual, Paul says, but they're the product of merely human teaching. And again, they don't lead people to Christ. As mentioned, verse 23, the final verse in this passage, is a bit challenging to read. There are several different renderings. The one I prefer is actually suggested by Peter O'Brien in his Word commentary series work on Colossians. And it's a bit different from our ESV translation that you heard at the beginning. So I'll read it in O'Brien's translation, which I've adapted slightly to make it a little bit more understandable for us. These things have a reputation for wisdom in the spheres of voluntary worship, humility, and severe treatment of the body. But they're without any value whatsoever. They lead only to the gratification of the flesh. The key difference here is that O'Brien's translation, along with that of some other commentators as well, sees the difficult phrase that ESV translates as they're of no value in subduing the flesh, as actually saying the opposite, that they actually gratify the flesh. We've heard about the severe treatment of the body as a false way of cultivating humility in order supposedly to enter into angelic worship. The opponent's teaching on this topic sounds, again, very wise. I mean, it's talking about angels being united in worship of heaven, but actually, all following that teaching does is to gratify the flesh, not the physical body, but the way that Paul most often uses that term in the New Testament, the prideful sense of self-achievement and religious accomplishment that comes from living under those regulations. These folks are kind of singing Frank Sinatra's tune, "I did it my way," and it's not God's way. Well, here Paul ends his overt critique of the opponents. In the remainder of the letter, as we'll begin to see next time, he'll show the Colossians the way they are called to live and walk instead, as a product of their life in union with the crucified and risen Christ, rather than as any attempt to enter more fully into that life. Again, they already have it. Now they're going to need to walk it out his way. We'll see more about that next time.